9 a.m. We have breaking news from Buckingham Palace, with King Charles announcing that his cancer treatment schedule will be reduced in the new year.
9 Europe correspondent Mimi Becker has the details.
For the first time, palace doctors have shared a worrying health update about King Charles, and the news is sending ripples through Buckingham Palace. Senior officials were called in quickly, and the language they used was unusually direct. This is not just another royal health scare. This is something that could affect the king's duties, his family, and even the future of the monarchy. What does this mean for King Charles and those closest to him? Could this change the line of succession sooner than anyone expected? Join us as we dive into the full story behind this shocking revelation. The emergency update that changed everything. It was exactly 10:45 on the morning of Thursday, December 1st. 2026, when the emergency call went out across Clarence House. The palace phones rang in rapid succession. Alerts pinged on encrypted devices, and senior aides, accustomed to routine scheduling and ceremonial minutiae, suddenly found themselves sprinting through corridors they had walked for decades with deliberate calm. The message was simple but urgent. Immediate medical briefing regarding His Majesty. Within minutes, the room designated for confidential consultations was cleared of all but essential personnel. The chief medical officer of the royal household, a man in his late 60s who had served under 3 monarchs and commanded quiet respect for his discretion and rigor, entered first, followed closely by 2 of the king's personal physicians. The gravity in their eyes was unmistakable. Everyone present, senior aides, the private secretary, and the Lord Chamberlain, immediately understood that this was not a routine report. The doors closed and the air shifted. No one spoke, and even the soft ticking of the antique clock on the far wall seemed too loud, too deliberate. The chief medical officer, clearing his throat, began with words that were measured yet chilling. "We have new developments concerning His Majesty's health that require immediate attention and careful consideration. This is not an update to be circulated beyond this room." The reaction was instantaneous. A hush fell over the group, punctuated only by the scribbling of notes on leather-bound pads. Senior officials, each with decades of experience managing crises of protocol, security, and public relations, sensed the magnitude immediately. What struck them first was the precise, restrained language. Doctors do not speculate. They report facts. And the way this report began, with emphasis on secrecy and urgency, indicated that the facts themselves were unsettling. The briefing detailed subtle but concerning changes in King Charles's vitals over the last several weeks. Blood pressure fluctuations, irregular heart rhythms, and fatigue that had been dismissed in public statements now appeared more persistent than previously reported. What the attending physicians emphasized was not panic, but precision. "These patterns," the chief medical officer said, "require immediate monitoring and may necessitate a temporary adjustment to daily routines and engagements." For those in the room, the words sank in slowly but deeply. It was not a single event or incident that had prompted this meeting, but a confluence of indicators. The king, 77 years old, had always projected energy and composure, often rising to greet dignitaries or preside over ceremonies despite private discomfort. Now, however, the progression of medical markers suggested that even His Majesty's resilience had limits. The Lord Chamberlain, his face carefully composed, leaned forward. "We understand the situation," he said. "But how immediate is the concern? Are we facing a crisis, or is this a precautionary measure?" The chief medical officer looked around the room, eyes steady. "We are moving beyond precaution. While this is not a life-threatening emergency at this moment, the trajectory of these developments cannot be ignored. It is imperative that we adjust both engagements and oversight accordingly, and that all communications remain tightly controlled." It was clear that the palace now faced a situation that demanded both discretion and swift action. Confidentiality protocols were reinforced. No public announcement, no leaks, and no speculation. The small group in the room understood that what they knew, even in partial form, would shape the monarchy's approach to stability in the weeks and months ahead. what palace doctors are really seeing behind the scenes. Behind the closed doors of Clarence House, away from public view and media speculation, the doctors monitoring King Charles's health have been observing a set of changes that had quietly alarmed them for weeks. While outwardly the king continues to attend selected engagements with his characteristic poise, the subtle progression of certain medical markers cannot be hidden. These are not the dramatic headline-grabbing moments the public might expect, but patterns that speak volumes to those trained to interpret them. The chief medical officer explained to the inner circle that the king's heart rhythm, previously noted as slightly irregular but manageable, had shown intermittent episodes that required continuous monitoring. It is not immediately dangerous, he assured the aides, but it cannot be ignored. The risk is cumulative if left unchecked. Blood pressure measurements, which historically fluctuated within acceptable ranges, were now demonstrating variability that hinted at fatigue of the cardiovascular system under sustained stress. Perhaps most concerning to palace physicians, however, was a subtle shift in energy levels and recovery time. King Charles, who had long maintained a schedule that combined ceremonial duties, private meetings, and charitable engagements, now required longer periods of rest between activities. Observing him during briefings and travel, doctors noted micro-signs of strain, delayed responses, mild tremors in his hands, and a weariness that, while easily masked in public appearances, spoke to underlying physiological stress. Laboratory results, reviewed in secret over the past month, painted a picture that had initially seemed inconclusive. Blood panels, hormone levels, and cardiac biomarkers were within ranges considered manageable for a man of his age. But when analyzed in combination with recent physical observations, doctors recognized a trend that required immediate adaptation of routines. One consultant quietly described it as the early signs of a cumulative decline that, if unmonitored, could complicate decision-making and public engagements. The palace medical team had also begun reviewing medications, supplements, and past medical history to identify any contributing factors. The king's regimen, carefully managed for decades, had been adjusted in small increments over time. Now, even minor adjustments had noticeable effects, and the doctors were watching for how the body would respond to increased stress or changes in schedule. It was a delicate balance. Any intervention had to respect the king's autonomy while ensuring his health was protected. In practical terms, these observations meant the king could no longer maintain the intensity of his previous routine. Scheduled trips abroad, ceremonial events, and public receptions required careful consideration. Private aides were instructed to monitor travel fatigue, hydration levels, and exposure to cold or heat. The message was simple but urgent. Even small lapses could create setbacks that might take weeks to overcome. The subtlety of these health issues, however, posed its own challenge. King Charles has always been determined to project strength and stability. Any visible sign of strain risks both public perception and confidence in his leadership. Palace doctors therefore emphasized discretion, creating coded systems to communicate concerns without alarming the king or the broader household. Senior aides, trained in both protocol and psychology, were integrated into this process, monitoring signals and adjusting schedules accordingly. It was this careful, behind-the-scenes vigilance that had prompted the emergency briefing described earlier. The combination of minor physiological irregularities, cumulative fatigue, and shifting recovery patterns created a scenario that could not be managed through routine oversight alone. Doctors insisted on immediate adjustments and close observation, framing their language in terms of measured urgency to ensure the palace took the matter seriously without creating unnecessary panic. By the end of the week, palace aides had begun restructuring the king's calendar. Non-essential engagements were postponed indefinitely, private meetings shortened or relocated to more accessible spaces, and staff were instructed to maintain constant readiness to respond to medical needs. Even small details, from travel routes to seating arrangements, were evaluated for potential strain on the king. In effect, the palace had entered a new rhythm, one dictated by the king's health rather than ceremonial tradition or political necessity. Behind the polished appearances and curated public messaging, the royal household was learning to operate in a state of quiet vigilance, monitoring indicators that might have been overlooked in the past, but which now carried consequences that could ripple across both family and institution. The doctor's observations, though carefully contained, had already begun to reshape palace operations. And as they continued to monitor King Charles day by day, every decision carried weight. Each engagement accepted or declined. Every moment of public exposure, and even private conversations were filtered through the lens of health management. In the world of monarchy, where image and stability intertwine with personal well-being, the stakes had never been higher. The moment King Charles was told the full truth. It was shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, December 6, 2026, when King Charles entered a quiet chamber in Clarence House, accompanied only by his chief medical officer and a single personal physician. The room was deliberately sparse, softly lit, with thick curtains drawn against the winter light. The king, 77 years old, carried his usual calm composure, though the faint lines of concern around his eyes betrayed that he sensed the gravity of the meeting. The doctors, unusually direct for the palace protocol, wasted no time in presenting the latest assessment. "Your Majesty," the chief medical officer began, voice even and carefully measured, "we need to be candid about your current condition. There are developments that require immediate adjustments to your daily schedule and ongoing monitoring." Charles, who had long been accustomed to the delicate phrasing of palace briefings, felt the unusual bluntness immediately. He straightened in his chair and regarded the doctors with an intensity that commanded precision. "What exactly does this mean?" he asked, voice steady but tinged with concern. "Am I at immediate risk? Or are we discussing a long-term concern?" The chief medical officer leaned forward slightly. "It is not a sudden emergency," he clarified, "but the pattern of your cardiovascular indicators, combined with fatigue and other subtle markers, means that we cannot proceed as before. Some engagements must be postponed or modified. Recovery periods will need to be longer. The trajectory cannot be ignored." The words landed like stones in the king's mind. For decades, Charles had been accustomed to projecting unwavering strength, balancing the ceremonial duties of a monarch with personal passions and charitable work. To hear that even measured activity could pose a strain challenged not only his sense of capability but his perception of duty. "Do I have options?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "Can treatments restore my energy to previous levels?" The physician beside him shook her head gently. "We can manage symptoms, Your Majesty, but the body has limits. The goal now is sustainability and quality, rather than maintaining an unsustainable pace. Even minor overexertion could extend recovery or exacerbate underlying issues." Charles leaned back, absorbing the implications. He asked questions, sometimes precise, sometimes reflective. How long might he continue in full public view? Which engagements could be safely maintained, and which must be postponed? How would the family be affected if schedules were adjusted abruptly? Each question reflected a mind balancing personal concern with the responsibilities of monarchy. Psychologically, the moment marked a turning point. Charles had spent his life preparing for the role of sovereign, often imagining decades of steady leadership. Now, faced with the constraints of his own health, he was forced to confront a reality in which time was finite and plans were fragile. The recognition that his reign might need to adapt, not simply in ceremonial gestures but in its very rhythm, brought a weight that few outside the palace could fully comprehend. Yet, even in this moment of stark honesty, Charles demonstrated resilience. He requested clear protocols for monitoring his condition, insisted on maintaining control over which engagements were essential, and asked for strategies to communicate adjustments without alarming the public. In essence, he was already beginning to recalibrate the monarchy itself around the contours of his health. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the meeting concluded, Charles rose, offering a firm handshake to the doctors, and left the chamber with the same measured dignity he had always displayed. Behind closed doors, aides and physicians immediately began revising schedules. But the king had already internalized the gravity of the discussion. In those private moments, the reality crystallized. His life and reign were now inseparably intertwined with the limits of his health. The palace, accustomed to managing appearances and controlling public narrative, now faced a monarch fully aware of the stakes. For King Charles, the conversation marked not fear, but an awakening, a recognition that the path ahead would require careful planning, self-awareness, and a willingness to adjust a reign shaped over decades. This was a turning point, not only in how he viewed his own mortality, but in how he would navigate the delicate balance between personal well-being and institutional expectation. Why the palace can no longer control the timeline. As the doctor's warnings settled into palace routines, the reality of King Charles's health began colliding with decades of meticulously planned engagements. Long-established calendars, public ceremonies, state visits, and charity events suddenly became unmanageable. The traditional rhythm of monarchy, once dictated by protocol and expectation, was now constrained by medical necessity. Palace aides and the Lord Chamberlain worked quietly to revise schedules without triggering public speculation. Every engagement required careful scrutiny. How long would the king be away from Clarence House? How much travel could he endure? Could ceremonial duties be shortened or delegated without undermining authority? What had once been a straightforward orchestration of tradition had become a complex negotiation with health itself. For example, a visit planned to Northern Ireland in late December had to be postponed indefinitely. Even short trips outside London were being reconsidered. Doctors emphasized that the king could not tolerate consecutive days of intensive activity without extended rest periods. Meetings previously assumed to be minor, a presentation of honors or a short audience with a visiting diplomat, now required medical clearance. Every decision carried weight. An unplanned strain could expand for weeks. Meanwhile, palace communications teams began crafting explanations. Public statements would need to frame postponements as precautionary or scheduling adjustments, avoiding any mention of health specifics. Staff were instructed to respond consistently, ensuring that even well-intentioned aides or friends would not inadvertently hint at the true scope of the issue. The challenge was unprecedented. The monarchy, long an expert at controlling narrative, now had to navigate the intersection of transparency, discretion, and uncertainty. Physicians' recommendations extended beyond scheduling. The king was advised to modify daily routines, including morning briefings, ceremonial rehearsals, and travel arrangements. Rest periods had to be strictly observed, meals carefully timed, and even social interactions calibrated to minimize strain. The palace now operated in a dual system. Public appearances continued, but behind the scenes, a continuous monitoring network ensured that even small deviations could be identified and corrected before they became problematic. The king himself played an active role in this recalibration. He approved adjustments to engagements, prioritized certain events, and personally oversaw how delegations were assigned. By integrating his own awareness with the doctor's guidance, he maintained authority while safeguarding health. This delicate balance highlighted the tension between institutional expectation and personal limitation, a tension the palace had rarely confronted so openly. Complicating matters further were long-term projects and international commitments. Treaties, diplomatic receptions, and charitable events were not merely ceremonial. They had implications for policy, international perception, and the monarchy's influence. Every delay required careful management, and aides were tasked with planning contingencies to preserve continuity and stability. The health of the sovereign had now become inseparable from the functioning of the monarchy itself. The unprecedented situation also affected family dynamics. Senior royals, including Prince William and Catherine, were consulted more frequently, not only to support the king but to prepare for continuity in case adjustments became permanent. The household itself was being restructured, integrating medical oversight into daily operations in ways that had never been standard practice. For palace insiders, the sense of urgency was compounded by history. Previous royal health scares had often been brief and managed behind a veil of secrecy. Now, the combination of age, cumulative health indicators, and public expectation created a scenario that could no longer be fully controlled. Even the most carefully worded announcements could not entirely mask the reality. King Charles's health was dictating the timeline, and the palace had no choice but to follow. In effect, the monarchy was being recalibrated around a single, immutable fact. The king's body, not tradition or expectation, now set the rhythm of state and ceremony. Every decision, from the rescheduling of events to the pacing of public appearances, reflected the intersection of medical reality and institutional continuity. The palace could manage perception, but it could not alter biology. And as aides quietly adjusted to this new reality, the awareness of vulnerability, for the first time, permeated every level of royal planning. William and Catherine step into quiet preparation mode. The moment King Charles received the unvarnished assessment from his doctors, a subtle ripple passed through the palace corridors. It reached, with particular immediacy, Prince William and Catherine, who had been briefed privately shortly afterward. The couple convened in a small sitting room at Kensington Palace, far from the public eye, and began the painstaking work of processing both the news itself and the implications for their roles within the royal family. For William, 75 years of royal training offered little guidance for this precise moment. His father, the reigning monarch, faced a level of vulnerability rarely discussed outside the walls of the palace. William's concern was immediate and personal, but it was tempered by the inexorable awareness that he would need to shoulder responsibilities with greater urgency. He asked careful questions. What adjustments would be necessary for ceremonial appearances? How would schedules need to shift in anticipation of recovery periods? What would the public narrative entail? Catherine, meanwhile, assumed a role that had long been second nature, stabilizer and protector. She quietly listened, assessed, and suggested practical measures that could ease strain on both her husband and the king. Her calm authority in these private discussions contrasted sharply with the tension of the news. While William wrestled with a sense of duty entwined with fear, Catherine's approach was methodical, organizing contingencies, noting which engagements could be delegated, and identifying family support structures. The couple also began discussing broader implications for the monarchy. With Charles's health now demanding longer periods of rest and medical oversight, they would inevitably be called upon to represent the crown more frequently, both domestically and internationally. Each scenario required careful consideration. Which ceremonies could William attend without undermining the king's authority, and which appearances might risk the perception of overstepping? This balancing act became a silent, ongoing negotiation within the couple's private meetings. Emotional conflict was ever present. William struggled to reconcile concern for his father's well-being with the reality of stepping into a more prominent public role. He worried about maintaining continuity for the monarchy while navigating his own anxieties about mortality and responsibility. Each decision was laden with dual significance: the practical, immediate need to adapt schedules and duties, and the deeper psychological weight of preparing for a time when his father might no longer be able to fulfill every aspect of his role. Catherine's influence extended beyond logistical planning. She monitored not only the king's appearances, but also William's responses, offering support, guidance, and reassurance. She reminded him of the importance of measured communication with staff and family, and of the need to protect private discussions from being inadvertently leaked. In doing so, she became both a strategic partner and emotional anchor, ensuring that their preparation was grounded in discretion, foresight, and resilience. Their private meetings became a daily ritual of sorts, a structured effort to anticipate challenges, delegate responsibilities, and maintain a semblance of normalcy amid a shifting reality. Through it all, William and Catherine maintained a shared understanding. The monarchy itself was being recalibrated around the king's health, and they were now integral participants in that process. Even in moments of quiet reflection, the weight of duty was unmistakable. William considered the lessons imparted by his father, now amplified by the immediacy of medical concerns. He recognized that personal emotions would have to coexist with institutional responsibility and that public perception would remain as crucial as private management. The shadow impact on Camilla and the inner circle. While William and Catherine adjusted behind the scenes, Queen Camilla faced her own private reckoning. In public, she maintained the poised composure expected of a queen consort. But within the confines of the palace, she bore the emotional weight of the king's condition alongside a small cadre of long-serving aides, private secretaries, and medical staff. Each was acutely aware that discretion was paramount. Even a hint of concern could cascade into public speculation, undermining the carefully managed perception of stability. Camilla's role was both emotional and strategic. She absorbed the gravity of the news silently, offering solace to Charles while shielding the broader household from panic. She coordinated with personal aides, overseeing schedules, ensuring that rest periods were respected, and subtly monitoring interactions between staff and the king. Her presence was steadying, yet every gesture was calculated. The inner circle relied on her calm, even as the tension around them grew. The inner circle experienced its own quiet anxiety. Aides who had served the monarchy for decades found themselves navigating uncharted territory. They had weathered previous health scares and public crises, but the directness of the latest update and the acknowledgement that it could influence long-term planning introduced a pervasive uncertainty. They were tasked with maintaining absolute discretion while simultaneously managing logistics, communication, and contingency planning. Doctors continued to provide detailed guidance, often in closed sessions with Camilla and select staff. These briefings outlined subtle fluctuations in the king's health, emphasizing areas that required monitoring without creating unnecessary alarm. The combination of constant vigilance, discreet adaptation, and emotional labor created a shadow environment in which every action was measured against the dual imperatives of care and secrecy. Isolation became an unspoken reality. The king, while supported by family and staff, was physically and emotionally separated from the public in ways dictated by medical necessity. Camilla, though ever present, absorbed much of the psychological burden, serving as intermediary between Charles, the household, and external advisors. The inner circle, in turn, experienced a heightened sense of responsibility. Any misstep could have consequences far beyond the immediate household, potentially shaping public perception and the functioning of the monarchy itself. The dynamic also underscored a paradox of royal life. Proximity does not equate to relief from stress. Those closest to the king often carry the heaviest weight, precisely because they must remain composed while managing variables hidden from public view. Camilla exemplified this, balancing empathy with strategic oversight, ensuring that every action supported both the king's health and the seamless operation of palace affairs. By mid-December, the palace's approach had evolved into a rhythm of silent coordination. Camilla and the inner circle orchestrated adjustments to events, travel, and communications, while maintaining an appearance of stability. The public continued to see the queen consort's grace, unaware of the continuous calculations guiding each decision. In these private moments, the monarchy's inner workings revealed a vulnerability rarely acknowledged. Even institutions built on centuries of tradition must adapt when health imperatives override protocol. What this means for the monarchy if things worsen. Even as King Charles' immediate health concerns were being managed, those closest to him understood that the situation demanded serious, forward-looking planning. Within the palace walls, the calm exterior of royal life could not mask the reality. The king's medical update had altered the rhythm of decision-making, forcing aides, advisors, and family members to confront difficult what-if scenarios. The monarchy, an institution built on centuries of precedent, could not afford to be unprepared. Every day, every engagement, every ceremonial obligation became entwined with the knowledge that health is fragile and unpredictable. Central to these discussions was the legal framework for a regency. The Regency Act of 1953, a piece of legislation long studied but rarely invoked, outlines the conditions under which a sovereign's powers may be delegated. Should King Charles become unable to perform his constitutional duties, a regent would assume certain responsibilities temporarily. In practice, that regent would almost certainly be Prince William, the heir apparent. The legal mechanics were straightforward, but the emotional and political dimensions were anything but. Preparing for such a possibility required not only careful procedural planning, but also an acknowledgement of personal and familial realities. William, privately, faced a profound tension between filial duty and public responsibility. On one hand, he remained deeply concerned for his father's well-being, attending medical briefings and offering support wherever appropriate. On the other hand, he was forced to confront the likelihood that he might need to act in a capacity he had spent decades anticipating but never wished to assume prematurely. Catherine, ever attentive and pragmatic, became the quiet stabilizer, guiding him through strategic considerations while shielding him from unnecessary stress. Their private conversations balanced hope with realism, love with the weight of duty, and emotional vulnerability with careful planning. A significant portion of the palace strategy involved reviewing the king's schedule and engagements. Every state visit, ceremonial event, and public appearance was examined under a new lens. Could it be postponed or delegated without drawing undue attention? How might the press interpret a missed engagement or an unexplained absence? Doctors' advice regarding rest and treatment had already begun influencing planning decisions, creating a tension between tradition and medical necessity. The monarchy's need to appear uninterrupted was now balanced against the king's right to privacy and health. Beyond the immediate family, palace aides and senior officials were engaged in a delicate choreography of preparation. Legal advisors studied protocols for both regency and temporary delegation of duties, ensuring that if circumstances changed rapidly, there would be no procedural confusion. Private secretaries and senior courtiers were tasked with drafting potential statements for both domestic and international audiences, emphasizing stability while preserving discretion. Even seemingly minor details, timing of press releases, the order of scheduled events, and the wording of official correspondence became critical in maintaining confidence in the institution. Emotionally, the palace atmosphere was layered and complex. For Charles, the knowledge that his health could limit his capacity to serve weighed heavily. He is, after all, a sovereign for whom duty is inseparable from identity. Even the most minor disruption in his ability to perform constitutional responsibilities carried symbolic significance. William, meanwhile, experienced the dual burden of preparing to lead while remaining a son attentive to his father's needs. Catherine, Camilla, and other close family members absorbed the emotional weight differently, each balancing personal concern with the necessity of public composure. The discussions also revealed the tension between visibility and secrecy. While the public sees an unbroken chain of ceremonial appearances, the inner workings of the palace are far more fluid, responsive, and strategic. The careful timing of each announcement, the management of social cues, and the placement of key figures during events are all informed by a subtle awareness of potential vulnerabilities. In this way, the monarchy maintains its image of stability while navigating the very human realities behind the crown. Another layer of complexity arose from the constitutional and political implications of a regency. Though largely procedural, the decision to activate any aspect of the Regency Act carries symbolic weight. Governments, parliamentarians, and international allies watch for signals, and even a temporary adjustment in power can spark discussion or concern. This made internal communications, briefing documents, and scenario planning all the more critical. Advisors rehearsed potential explanations for various contingencies, ensuring that each step would preserve the monarchy's legitimacy while minimizing speculation or unrest. For William and Catherine, the process of preparation was not just administrative. It was deeply personal. The thought of stepping into a temporary regency, or even preparing for one, brought with it questions about identity, legacy, and the nature of duty. The silence, the signals, and what comes next. In the wake of the shocking medical update, the palace settled into a carefully measured silence. Outwardly, Life carried on with the familiar cadence of ceremonial duties, public appearances, and carefully choreographed engagements. But beneath the surface, those closest to King Charles were acutely aware that the message delivered by doctors moments ago carried implications far beyond the confines of a private briefing room. Every movement, every decision, and every carefully chosen word became part of an intricate calculus, one that balanced transparency, discretion, and the fundamental need to maintain confidence in the monarchy. The silence surrounding the king's health is not a sign of negligence or denial. On the contrary, it reflects a deep-seated understanding of the delicate optics that surround the crown. The public, accustomed to seeing the sovereign in full command, would quickly notice any hint of irregularity. Even the smallest deviation, a cancelled engagement, a late arrival, or a carefully worded statement, could spark speculation. For this reason, the palace has learned to speak volumes without saying anything at all. Every gesture, every photograph, every public appearance is now layered with meaning, designed to reassure while protecting privacy. Observant aides and staff members have become attuned to subtle signals, internal communications, and quiet shifts in routine. A change in the king's daily schedule, for instance, may indicate an increased need for rest or a medical procedure. A new advisor appearing at a meeting could reflect a strategic shift in contingency planning. Even the timing of official communiques is scrutinized for hints of urgency or concern. Those within the inner circle understand that while nothing has been publicly confirmed, the body language, the whispers, and the silent adjustments are all part of a careful orchestration designed to safeguard both the king and the institution he serves. Queen Camilla, as always, plays a pivotal role in this delicate dance. Her public composure masks a profound emotional burden. In private, she absorbs the weight of uncertainty with measured grace, offering comfort and counsel to the king while maintaining the image of stability that the public expects. For Camilla, every decision is a balancing act between supporting her husband, reassuring the family, and upholding the dignity of the monarchy. She is both shield and anchor, navigating the pressures of a situation that few can truly comprehend. The inner circle, composed of long-serving aides, private secretaries, and trusted medical staff, is similarly attuned to the subtleties of the king's condition. Their roles, though largely invisible, are critical. They are the keepers of protocol, the managers of communication, and the silent observers who interpret shifts in behavior, mood, and stamina. The palace operates as a complex ecosystem, and during moments like this, every detail matters. What may appear as routine activity to the public is, in fact, a carefully calibrated response to uncertainty. Even as discretion dominates the immediate response, the palace is not ignoring preparation for the future. Contingency plans, rehearsals, and strategic discussions are ongoing behind closed doors. Each scenario, from temporary delegation of duties to full regency considerations, is examined in meticulous detail. Advisors anticipate questions from Parliament, the media, and international partners, crafting statements that maintain confidence without overexposure. Every potential outcome is mapped, every risk assessed, and every action weighed for its implications on both the king and the institution. If King Charles passes, the monarchy's next steps. The unthinkable, though carefully prepared for behind closed doors, is the passing of King Charles. It is a scenario that the palace contemplates with solemnity, not panic. Every detail, from protocol to public communication, from security to succession, is mapped out in exhaustive planning exercises. Yet the human reality of losing a sovereign is profound. For the king's family, his inner circle, and the nation, the moment of transition would be both personal and historic, emotional and constitutional. Immediately following the king's passing, the most visible and urgent shift would involve the heir apparent, Prince William. Within moments, William would assume the role of king, taking on the responsibilities, privileges, and burdens of the monarchy. The transition, though anticipated, is never easy. It involves not only stepping into the office but embodying centuries of tradition while reassuring a nation in mourning. The weight of expectation is immediate, and every move will be analyzed by advisors, media, and the public alike. Queen Camilla's role would shift dramatically as well. Traditionally, she would assume the title of Queen Consort with William's accession, a position that carries both ceremonial duties and symbolic significance. Yet in the immediate aftermath, her focus would likely remain on the family, providing stability for William, Catherine, and the children while navigating her own grief. Camilla's public composure would be crucial in setting a tone of dignity, continuity, and resilience at a time when emotions are raw and scrutiny is intense. Within the palace, the famous Operation London Bridge plan would be activated. This decades-old blueprint for royal succession outlines every procedural step, from notifying government officials to coordinating media coverage. Members of the royal household, advisors, and senior staff are trained to execute the plan with precision. There are instructions for public announcements, ceremonial arrangements, and the careful management of both domestic and international response. Everything is choreographed to ensure that the monarchy continues seamlessly, even amid profound loss. The country itself would enter a period of national mourning, typically lasting around 10 days, though the exact duration is determined by both tradition and circumstance. Flags would be lowered, public events adjusted, and official messages of condolence issued. Television networks and newspapers would dedicate extensive coverage to the king's life, reign, and legacy. Public reaction would be deeply emotional, as citizens reflect on both personal memories of the king and the historical significance of his passing. This period is designed not only to honor the sovereign, but to provide the nation with a structured process for collective grief. Constitutionally, the passing of a monarch triggers a series of formal acts. The new king, William, would swear an oath to uphold the laws and duties of the crown. Ministers, members of parliament, and government officials would offer formal recognition of his accession. The transition, while ceremonial, carries enormous weight. It is a reminder that the monarchy, while deeply personal in its relationships, is fundamentally a constitutional institution that underpins the stability of the United Kingdom. The impact on the wider royal family would also be immediate and profound. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis would find themselves living in a world shaped by their grandfather's legacy and their father's new responsibilities. The family would be observed constantly, both for the continuity of the monarchy and for public reassurance. Catherine, as consort to the new king, would shoulder increased responsibilities herself, balancing the demands of public life, family stability, and the emotional toll of the transition. For senior aides, private secretaries, and household staff, the death of the king is both a personal loss and a professional crucible. They must manage logistical realities, funeral arrangements, public statements, and historical records, while supporting the family emotionally. Their discretion, calm, and competence become critical to maintaining the dignity of the monarchy during a period of intense scrutiny. Behind every public gesture, there is a web of preparation, observation, and careful orchestration that few outside the palace truly understand. Internationally, the death of a monarch sends ripples across diplomatic, financial, and political spheres. Leaders of the Commonwealth, foreign heads of state, and global institutions pay tribute while anticipating the implications of a new sovereign. Ceremonial visits, messages of condolence, and media coverage are coordinated with sensitivity to both tradition and diplomacy. The monarchy is not only a national institution, but a global symbol, and transitions are watched closely by millions around the world. Public perception, always delicate during periods of royal transition, becomes a central concern. The palace carefully manages what is shared and how it is shared. Statements emphasize the king's achievements, his dedication to duty, and the continuity of the monarchy. Images of the family together, the new king assuming his responsibilities, and the ceremonial acts of succession are designed to reassure citizens and international observers alike. The messaging is simultaneously a tribute, a reassurance, and a statement of continuity. Yet for all the protocol and planning, there is an undeniable human cost. Grief is personal and unpredictable. Family members, close friends, and those who have served the king for decades must navigate sorrow while performing the roles expected of them. The public rarely sees these private moments, yet they are as integral to the transition as the ceremonies themselves. The weight of expectation does not erase emotion. It demands that it be managed, often in quiet, private ways. In the days and weeks following the king's death, decisions about memorials, charitable foundations, and historical legacies come into play. The monarchy, while rooted in tradition, is also a living institution that evolves.